Everyone. My name is Andrew Pomerville, and I'm happy to serve as the 11th president here at Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. And it is my delight and honor to be here to not only welcome you to the lecture series, but to engage in this conversation together and continue to think about what it means for us to live out our calls, both on campus and off campus. Our lecture series all have a particular theme and are sponsored by some of our generous benefactors from the past. And the Greenhoe Lecture is certainly important, but one I'm going to say is actually really interesting to me. It comes from Midland Memorial Presbyterian Church. I have preached at that church a number of times. Love those clergy and love those elders and folks there. It is amazing to see that connection. The Greenhoe Lecture series was named in honor of their former pastor at Midland Memorial Presbyterian Church, Dr. Theodore M. Greenhoe. Dr. Greenhoe was a member of the Louisville Seminary class of 1934, and the Greenhoe Lecture was established in 1966. In order to introduce our speaker for tonight, I am happy to introduce my colleague, the Reverend Amina McIntyre, Assistant Visiting Professor of Practical Theology. Professor McIntyre?
Good evening, everyone here in the room as well as online. I'm going to introduce our speaker for today first by presenting a couple of her words, as she is for her, narrative is very important, so who better to tell some of her narrative than by a couple of the words that she has written herself. Ethnography, used as a pastoral practice, can subvert institutional pressures to maintain the status quo by helping a faith community recall its stories, its strengths, and its soul. From Ethnography as a Pastoral Practice, an introduction. The possibility of joy as a path of life comes through experiences of embodied loving care and the realization that we are ourselves related to the whole of life and beloved of God, caring for joy, narrative theology, and practice. Mary Clark Moschella is the Roger J. Squire Professor of Pastoral Care and Counseling at Yale Divinity School. She earned her BS from Southern Connecticut State College, her MDiv from Harvard Divinity School, and a PhD from Claremont School of Theology. Professor Moschella previously taught pastoral theology and congregational care at Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C., and before that, she was a chaplain and then a pastor in the United Church of Christ congregations in Massachusetts. Her research focuses are on three main areas: ethnographic research methods in practical theology, joy in the ministry and in life, and currently narrative approaches to spiritual care. She teaches a research methods course to equip students with skills needed to observe, engage, and understand faith communities and collectives. She co-leads the study group for religious practices and pastoral research in the Society for Pastoral Theology. Her publications include the updated and expanded second edition of Ethnography as a Pastoral Practice, an introduction, Living Devotions, Reflections on Immigration, Identity, and Religious Imagination, and a collection of essays edited by Jane Maynard and Leonard Hummel, Pastoral Bearings, Lived Religion, and Pastoral Theology. Her book, she also has a book, Caring for Joy, Narrative Theology and Practice, and she also has co-edited a publication, Qualitative Research in Theological Education, with Susan Willock. Dr. Moschella also co-edited with Lee Butler, the Ed Wimberly Reader, a Black pastoral theology. Her current project is actually focused around narrative spiritual care theories and practice, which she will also speak about tonight. Please join me so much in welcoming Dr. Mary Clark Moschella.
Thank you so much. I want to begin by thanking Dean Deborah Mumford for inviting me to speak, to give this celebrated Greenhoe Lecture. It is indeed an honor. And thank you also to Nina Goodman-Carroll, who has helped me get here and support me in many ways, and the others who have offered hospitality and support along the way. I also want to thank my colleagues and students back home in the Practical Theology Department at Yale Divinity School, who took time to listen to me and help me formulate these ideas. And finally, thank you for coming. You could have heard Tim Walls tonight. And you chose to be here, so I am indeed honored. So, Justice and self-care. How often do we hear these two things spoken about together in the same sentence? These words conjure up differing images in our minds. The term justice, let's see if I can get this right. Okay. Trying to make this other way. Okay. It worked before. Justice connotes basic fairness, righteousness, and equity, right? And people in this room think, that's okay, no worries. We may think of the biblical prophets living in the wilderness, eating locusts and wild honey, following God's call to travel to far-off places and cry out against injustice. Since the prophets were critics, they were usually not that popular, as you may recall, and they suffered the predictable anger of the people they called out for their wrongdoing. The notion of caring for justice in our time may also bring to mind gifted orators, religious and political leaders like William Barber, who has revived the Poor People's Campaign of 1968, and to lift up the cause of those who suffer injustice and poverty, whether because they are unhoused, imprisoned, hungry, unemployed, or underpaid. Caring for justice can be exciting work, like especially around an election when we're getting people registered to vote, or in canvassing door to door, as I did recently in Pennsylvania. But justice work can also be exhausting and at times depressing when your cause or your candidate does not prevail. Even when your cause wins and you feel in some sense that you're making a difference in the world or that some measure of good has been achieved, still the work itself can be draining and depleting. No matter how just the cause, we are limited beings, and sometimes the well runs dry. Popular narratives about self-care, by contrast, Okay. Sorry. Okay. All right. Self-care narratives suggest almost the direct opposite of working for justice. Self-care has become a trope. There we go. Thank you. In our time, in the advertising industry, excuse me, it sells things. Online, we see ads for spa services, massages, and facials given in beautiful South Sea Island locations for those who can afford to take a wellness retreat that is all about you. Self-care is used to sell everything from luxury cars to jewelry to vacations and even plastic surgery. And of course, we might call that last one self-harm as self-care. But the message is, be good to yourself. You deserve it. Spend some money. These ads proclaim your right to take care of you, to indulge in fancy pleasures, to feed your most solipsistic instincts. These notions of self-care seem about as far away as we can get from a life devoted to justice, fairness, and concern for the least and the lost. So these two ideas, justice and self-care, may strike us as radically opposed to each other. Caring for justice involves caring for the world, whether that is working against social evils like poverty, racism, and violence, or working for the creation of life-giving policies and programs for the common good. Self-care, by contrast, is concerned with personal well-being, and even if it is not defined by the advertising industry, but by spiritual practices like prayer, meditation, or reading sacred texts, Self-care still involves focusing on myself, my body, heart, mind, and soul, and it can seem wrong, given the needs of the world, to direct so much attention inward toward our personal well-being, rather than outward toward the good of the many. As it happens, I teach in a field called pastoral theology and care that embraces concern for both the one and the many, or as my beloved colleague Larry Kent Graham, I'll just point this at you. There we go. Larry Kent Graham once put it, care of persons, care of worlds. Pastoral theologians think about the way these two goods are intertwined. The well-being of individual persons both determines and depends upon the well-being of the many, including the families, the communities, and the natural environments that support us. The field of pastoral theology also ponders the one beyond the many, as H. Richard Niebuhr once put it, the transcendent reality, the holy, the goodness that sustains all life. In this field, the love of God, self, and neighbor are all embraced, and they are not seen as competing goods, but as interconnected aspects of human flourishing. Barbara McClure says that pastoral care assumes that the love of God is enfleshed in the love of neighbor and self. Thus, well-being is both holistic and corporate. A person cannot be fully well in an unjust world. Similarly, a just society depends on the well-being of its leaders and members. But even if we come to know and believe in the interconnectedness of these goals, justice and self-care, we live in a culture that generally does not support the integration of these two things. On the one hand, the work in caring for justice can be split off from our everyday worlds of work and family. And it may seem too hard or too overwhelming to get involved in community programs or political activism. On the other hand, even spiritually focused self-care takes time, and that is what many people have very little of. We also have varying levels of agency when it comes to self-care. If you are working 2 jobs to support a family, or if you are a member of the sandwich generation, caring for both your parents and your children at the same time, or if you are a student with multiple deadlines and a job and little time left over for yoga classes, the idea of self-care can seem out of reach. And the media around us doesn't help. It worked. Reading the paper, we see photographs depicting endless wars, destruction, and violence. While on the opposite page, or if you read your news online, in between articles, colorful advertisements for sparkling jewelry and watches appear. Where is it easier to rest your gaze? On the pictures of suffering or the pictures of baubles? Our hopes for justice may seem too distant, while our attempts at self-care can become mere distractions. We live in cultural worlds that distort our options, communicating that we can either dedicate ourselves to saving the world, or if we are lucky enough to afford it, escape into indulgence. Given that we live in these worlds, how can we chart our own paths toward living out of our values and not someone else's? Howard Thurman once put it this way. He said, "You are the only you that has ever lived. If you cannot hear the genuine in you, you will, all your life, spend your days on the ends of strings that somebody else pulls." I look at this quandary through the lens of narrative spiritual care. The narrative lens challenges us to think about the stories we hear in the culture around us and the stories that we're telling ourselves about who we are and how we ought to live. The narrative perspective asserts that these stories matter, and if we can change our stories, reauthor them, we can gain agency in how we actually live our lives. Narrative conversations can help us hear the sound of the genuine in us instead of spending our days on the ends of strings that somebody else pulls. As the title of my lecture suggests, narrative conversations work with both resistance and resonance. So let's talk about resistance first. Narrative conversations invite us to examine and resist the dominant cultural narratives that surround us and try to pull our strings. Dominant cultural narratives are stories that come to us through the media and the social surround, offering us limited and false choices. I began tonight with a dominant cultural narrative that tells us that caring for justice is the polar opposite of self-care, but we've already begun to interrogate that narrative, to deconstruct it, as we say, to ask where it comes from and whether or not it rings true. Pastoral theologian Shaniqua Walker Barnes, in her book of devotions, Self-Care, Daily Practices for Nurturing Our Whole Selves, digs into this work of deconstruction and resistance. She challenges the story of self-care as mere distraction or self-indulgence, and instead describes 8 aspects of what she calls sacred self-care. For example, care as a practice of gratitude for God's gift of life. Self-care as self-love, which is different from selfishness. Self-care as stewardship, taking care of the life that God has given us. Self-care as wellness, and my personal favorite, self-care as subversive. And here I will quote Dr. Walker Barnes. She writes, "Self-care should be the most natural thing in the world. We should be innately inclined to devote a significant part of our time and energy to caring for ourselves, taking the time to prepare, cook, and eat nutritious meals, moving our bodies in ways that challenge and restore us, getting good sleep, spending time with people whom we love and who love us, spending time in prayer and meditation, and experiencing joy and pleasure. Instead, we find ourselves fighting to carve out some little space and time to sustain our lives. This is not an accident," she writes. "It's the product of living in a hyper-capitalist society built on a slave economy which reduced people to commodities to be exploited. The logic of this economy persists today. It teaches all of us that our worth is dependent on our productivity and service to others. Sacred self-care is not an act of indulgence," she writes, "it is an act of resistance." So do you see what she did there? Right? First, Dr. Walker Barnes examined the story we've been told by the world and sometimes even by the church, that taking time out for yourself is selfish and wrong. She then examines the history of this notion and traces it to hyper-capitalist values built on a slave economy that measure human worth in terms of output and productivity. She rejects this cultural narrative and then goes on to reauthor her story. That's a good narrative word, reauthor, linking it to her faith and claiming instead that self-care is a natural and healthy part of human living, a way of honoring God's gift of life. So that is an example of resistance, resisting the world's values and refusing to be reduced to a commodity to be exploited. For Dr. Walker Barnes, self-care is not separate from the work of justice. It is actually a form of resistance to the injustice of racism. The author then goes on to tell her story of her self-care journey, offering brief biblical reflections on different aspects of self-care that she has recognized as important and necessary and good in her life, excuse me, as related to her faith and calling. And she suggests that, more of this? Excuse me. We can think of self-care as the practices that help us to develop and nurture holistic wellness as beings who are beautifully and wonderfully created by God in God's own image and likeness, and to sustain our vitality as agents of God's mission of justice, mercy, and peace in the world. Does this new narrative ring true to you? Does it resonate with what you know about yourself, your values, and your faith? If so, I invite you to ask yourself what self-care practices, sacred self-care practices, look like in your life. And of course, the answer to this question is going to be different for each of us, but I suspect there will be some common themes in our stories, some basic dimensions of our lives that need care and attention. There are numerous books and resources that you can use to support sacred self-care. Excuse me. Authors on wellness often divide self-care into 6 or 8 areas, sometimes pictured as a pie chart or as buckets. I like this image of a tree with an array of spiritual self-care practices represented in each of its branches. This illustrates the organic connection between different spiritual practices and the connection between justice work and self-care as well. In my own life, I like to think of self-care practices in basic terms, verbs that are easy to remember. They include sleep, move, connect, eat, read, write, relax. Like Dr. Walker Barnes, I see self-care as intimately related to wellness and justice. I'm just going to say a little bit about each of these and ask you to note if any of them resonate with you or bring up your own ideas about self-care in your life. First practice, sleep. We know that, medically speaking, sleep is crucial for the well-being of our brains and our bodies. It is not optional. While there may be times when something important interrupts our sleep, like a crying baby, for example, or an urgent task, we still have to contend with the reality that our bodies, our mind, spirit, body unities, need rest. I myself show up less well and less attentive to my students or less energized at my writing desk if I have less than 7 hours sleep. Sleep, though, for me can be elusive. My mind is busy, and as my husband says, there is no off switch. I have, over the years, found hacks to help me if I should, for example, wake up in the night agonizing over this dilemma or that. I have several breathing routines I go through. The famous 4-7-8, for example. Inhale to 4, hold it for 7, and then release your breath over 8. Or box breathing, deep breathing, shallow breathing. I use them all. Or I listen to a sleep meditation on Insight Timer. Or I put on a nightlight and read something, preferably something boring, that can bring my eyes to droop. Beyond this, I've learned to set an intention to get to bed earlier, to cut off screen time, to take a warm shower, etc. What is your sleep story? What intention might you like to set for yourself to honor this important human need? Move is my second practice, and I put this one in my planner. This is about exercise, and I've learned in my life and at my age, this is not optional either. Sometimes we have to get creative to find ways to move through our lives. Students laugh when I say vacuuming counts as an exercise. You don't have to join a gym or take regular classes, but having some social accountability does help. Walking the dog, for example, is good for both parties. If you find some form of movement you love, like hiking or basketball or swimming or dancing, then the trick is to schedule it into a busy life. I look at it this way: if and when our bodies allow us to move, it is good and wise to do so, to develop and maintain physical strength, agility, and freedom to move through the world feeling fully alive. Do not deny yourself the gift of being fully alive in your body. Sometimes self-care practices overlap with each other. If you play team sports, for example, you're both getting physical exercise and connecting with the people on the team. To connect means, to me, tending relationships with people, with nature, and with God. A couple of weeks ago, when I experienced the joy of walking door to canvas in Pennsylvania, I saw how, along with getting exercise, this event involved connecting with people, both the people behind the doors we knocked and the people who kindly hosted our stay. My spouse and I were overwhelmed by the kindness of a couple who took us into their home, fed us, and nurtured us for 4 days with their friendship and support. Friendship and loving relationships are important. Let us not neglect them, right? They feed our emotional and spiritual well-being and nurture us for the work of justice making. Connecting with others also links to shared meals, and if we are intentional, eating well together. For me, eating well involves considering my health and well-being in what I choose to eat and drink. I realize I speak from a position of privilege as one who has a decent grocery store near where I live, where I can buy fresh fruits and vegetables and proteins, and I have enough money to shop there. To whatever extent one can, I think it is essential to make healthy choices to nourish our body-spirit unity. As the granddaughter of Italian immigrants, I learned early the wonder of delicious food and the blessing of cooking and feeding people. In this way, self-care blends over into the joy of caring for others. And in our recent canvassing excursion, I saw how many people participate in political organizing just by feeding the workers, bringing meals to the polls and other places. Also on my list is read. I like to begin the day by reading something devotional, broadly defined. Lately, this has revolved around poetry. If you're pressed for time, you can ask yourself, how long does it take to read a poem? Okay. Poems capture vivid realities with a few precise words. They help me name certain thoughts and emotions, and they help me see more beauty. Lately, I read poems by Mary Oliver with her steadfast gaze at the sea, at nature, and all its creatures. I read Nikki Giovanni with her focus on love and Black pride. And I read John O'Donohue with his Celtic awareness of our souls dwelling within our bodies and within the land. Maybe it's reading a Bible passage or an inspiring spiritual reflection that can help you center your day in goodness and love. Reading then gives way to my practice of journal writing. My scattershot entries often come out in the form of a poem or a prayer. In any case, for me, it is important to take time to get centered, to be still before holiness and beauty, to get some perspective before plunging into the day. and it doesn't take long. On the days I write, it's maybe 10 minutes, but it goes a long way. My last self-care practice is relax, which I link up with keeping Sabbath. Shanika Walker-Barnes reminds us that in the Bible, keeping Sabbath is a commandment. It's not optional. Even if even God needed rest, why wouldn't we? This is not just sleep, but additional waking hours set aside, time off the clock. How do you find replenishment when the well is dry? How do you reconnect with the sound of the genuine in your soul? The answer will be different for each of us, but I think it does involve disconnecting from work and social media and news feeds, saying no to those things in order to be able to say yes to the people and the places you love, the pressure and the pressures that impinge upon you. I love going to my church, where after much prayer and searching, I have found a spiritual home. Excuse me. Whatever it is, I hope you will establish a habit of taking Sabbath time in order to rest, refresh, and replenish the well springs within. So, what are the sacred care practices you want to be part of your story? Whatever you decide, remember to engage in these practices with kindness and self-compassion, recognizing your dignity and worth in the sight of God. Even if all you can manage right now is to begin to look upon yourself with kindness as God looks upon you, that will be enough. Right. Thus far, we have talked about resistance to cultural stories and how to reauthor our stories and reconnect self-care and justice. Now let's consider resonance a little bit more directly. What is resonance? The quality of being loud and clear, the production of a sound, of vibration, a feeling, thought, memory that a piece of writing or music makes you have, or the quality of a piece of writing that makes this happen. When a story resonates with us, it strikes a chord in us. We hear it loud and clear. When it comes to caring for justice and for ourselves, I think we need to find resonance, both in the sense of what rings true and just in our stories, and resonance in the interpersonal sense, in the interpersonal realm, resonance with other people and our communities, our families, and our colleagues. When we resonate with another person's story, we gain strength for the journey. So let me give you an example of this second kind of resonance, this interpersonal resonance. This comes from Anne Lamott's recent book, Somehow, Thoughts on Love. Lamott tells the story of a small progressive congregation where the pastor held an open meeting she described as a radical Jesus group. Okay. About 30 people came together for the first night with a lot of great ideas about how to enact their faith in their community by doing works of justice together. Their long list of projects included starting a homeless shelter in the church, which would require building bathrooms and serving meals. Another group wanted to install solar panels to address the ecological crisis. Another good idea. And then still another group was very angry about a local radio station spewing hate towards the LGBTQ plus community and wanted to hold a boycott of the station and plan a massive pride parade to counteract it. So each group had strong feelings and ambitious ideas of how to work for justice in their community. But when they met the second time to try to figure out where to start, the pastor noticed the people in the group looked exhausted and they were fighting over whose cause was most important. The Radical Jesus group was agitated, and the pastor was beginning to regret having started it. But then someone in the group suggested that they should all try to be radical Jesus to each other first, and that everyone should go home and ask in prayer for what they themselves needed, and come back the next week willing to share and willing to ask for help. So only 10 people showed up the next week. But one by one, they described their own needs for care and asked the group for help. For example, one woman mentioned that she was struggling with her weight and asked if anyone would be willing to take walks with her. She got 2 volunteers. One man said he felt like he was spinning out of control and needed someone to sit and pray with him. The pastor volunteered for that one. They started sitting outside on his porch and praying together from time to time. For several weeks, the group just went on this way, praying and trying to help each other out. Sometime later, the group got around to implementing their projects. They remodeled the church basement and made it a shelter for unhoused people. They went solar, and they helped start a town pride parade. Somehow, as Anne Lamott puts it, after people began to pray and tend to their own needs and ask for help, they started to hear each other better. They were able to find resonance and shared values. And this helped them come together to do the work of justice in their town. So this story illustrates a couple of important things about justice work. First, it can be complicated and demanding to try to make the world, or even one small corner of it, better. It is not always easy to find consensus, even in the church, or perhaps I should say, especially in the church. But in order to move forward on a prophetic agenda, we need each other. We need to find people with whom we can share our stories and build solidarity. We also need to become aware of our own needs and unafraid to ask for help so that we can approach the work of justice as vulnerable and interdependent beings, not lone rangers prone to burnout and disappointment. A final example of resonance comes from the world of movement chaplaincy and the writing of Dr. Leah Gunning Francis on Ferguson and faith. Movement chaplaincy is a form of ministry that has developed over the last 15 years, where chaplains go to the sites of protest movements to support and offer care to people who are raising their voices in protest. It started, I think, with the Occupy Wall Street movement, and it has expanded in recent years, especially to support the Black Lives Matter movement. This kind of justice work can be tough and even risky, and it may even be painful to hear about it tonight. Movement chaplains offer their support to the bereaved survivors of victims of police violence, as we saw in Ferguson, when a police officer shot and killed Michael Brown and left him lying in the street for 4 hours. As this terrible news spread, local faith leaders came together to pray and support the protesters who were in great pain. Chaplains and pastors from diverse faith communities quickly assembled and bravely created a line, in fact, between the police and the protesters, thereby preventing further violence from taking place. Reflecting on this later, Dr. Leah Gunning Francis writes, "Clergy practices of prayer created an awakening to the presence of God in unlikely places. The altars were moved out of the sanctuaries and into the streets, where they challenged people to see, hear, and feel the presence of God in the midst of the protests. The chanting, marching, and locking arms often symbolized a resolute strength and power that challenged us to consider why Black lives mattered to God and why they should matter to us all. The struggle for human dignity is a deeply theological issue," she writes, "for to be human is to be created in the image of God, and whenever one's humanity is distorted or discounted, it is an affront to God. So here we can see how the resonance between and among protesters and chaplains contributed to the strength and power of the movement, a movement which, though vilified, still continues. In January of 2023, another movement chaplain, the Reverend Vahisha Hassan, based in Memphis, offered pastoral care when Tyree Nichols was beaten and killed by police officers, and the deeply disturbing videos showing what had happened were released. It was reported that after Nichols was killed, his community of fellow skateboarders organized a vigil at a local skateboarding park. There, standing under the night sky, surrounded by a crowd, Hassan offered the opening prayer. And she said in her prayer, in order to do sustainable movement work, we need to have integrated wellness. How do we do this? How do we live and not die? We don't want the state to take our lives, but we don't want this work to take our life either. The overarching framework of my theory of change, she wrote, is that we need well people who are doing well work to create well systems. And I think that this is really an excellent summary of the lecture for tonight. We need well people doing well work to create well systems. If we can resist cultural narratives that tell us that self-care is nothing more than selfish indulgence in expensive pleasures, or that justice work is too hard and out of reach for ordinary people, we might be able to become well people doing well work and create more just and well social systems. If we can find resonance in our souls and in our communities, listening for the sound of the genuine, and we can integrate the work of justice and self-care in our lives, then we can integrate this work. Now, 23, I don't know what this is. So I want to just invite you to take a few moments to write down your own stories about justice and self-care, if you have something to write with. What, if anything you've heard tonight, rings true and fits with your values, beliefs, and aspirations for the life you want to live? Who are the people and groups in your life with whom you find resonance, connection, and common cause? With whom do you develop resolute strength, faith, and wisdom for your journey? I'll just give you a couple moments to do that. So let's just take 5 minutes to turn to someone near you and share, if you are willing, a little bit about what you've written. Close at 7. Then the Q&A starts then. They could also write So as you're ready, let's come back together in a group. Does anyone have one or two? Let's come back together as a group. I'm not good at this. Does anyone have any, maybe just one or two people could share if there is something you would like to share with the rest of the group. Yes?
Just knowing the difference of knowing what self-care really is, and my example is just laying on the couch and doing a lot of nothing and thinking that's self-care when it's not.
Well, some days it could be. Thank you. Anyone else?
This is for the people online.
Sure, no, that's fine. First time as a minister going to a spiritual director, and it was encouraged, you've got a lot going on, talk. And I sat down with the spiritual director. We're in his parlor, and he says, you know what, for the first 5 minutes, we're just going to sit in silence together and breathe. And that lasted about 7 seconds. And so I don't have time for this. There's too much that has to get done. How do I fix all my problems? And it was many sessions to realize later of, there was some value in taking care of ourselves in the middle of the resonance. That word helped. He reflected back all of my anxiety and worry about the world not changing fast enough, and was able to reflect and help me understand what did that mean about my own internal struggle.
Great, thank you. One more?
For me, one of the things that you spoke about was the way that our society makes us feel that self-care is indulgent.
Yes.
And I think guilt is a big issue that we have in our society, and that for me it was really freeing to be able to recognize, I feel that way because that's what the culture is telling me, and that I can say, maybe I don't need to feel that way anymore when I'm thinking clearly.
Wonderful, thank you. All right. Well, I'm sure we could continue, and we're going to have some time for questions and answers, but I want to just close off this part of it by reading a poem by Mary Oliver. There we go. Okay. Oh, no, wait, go back. This is Swan by Mary Oliver. Did you too see it drifting all night on the black river? Did you see it in the morning rising into silvery air? An armful of white blossoms, a perfect commotion of silk and linen as it leaned into the bondage of its wings, a snowbank, a bank of lilies, biting the air with its black beak. Did you hear it? Fluting and whistling, a shrill, dark music, like rain pelting the trees, like a waterfall, knifing down the black ledges. And did you see it, finally, under the clouds, a white cross streaming across the sky, its feet like black leaves, its wings like the stretching light of the river? And did you feel it in your heart, how it pertained to everything? And have you too finally figured out what beauty is for? And have you changed your life? Thank you. Thank you so much. We do have time for questions, yes. Comments?
I was fascinated by your comment about how capitalism drives us into the narrative that we buy into, drives us into that narrative. Could you just say a little bit more about that and kind of what other factors are seen as driving us into accepting that narrative?
Well, I think we live in a time where it's kind of like capitalism on steroids, like it's hyper. It's not just regular capitalism. And the pressure to produce grows more and more. And in this mindset, there are winners and losers in life. And the only way to be a winner is to work harder and harder and do more and more and to produce. And believe me, I work at an institution where this is very much, the word productivity is used quite often.
I taught at Yale, so.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, produce is often the message, even at a divinity school, right? When we're supposed to have some kind of values that might at least make us think about that a little bit. And I think it's really difficult in the world because, the way jobs are, it's so tight and people are pushed, so hard. I mean, I'm fortunate in a way because I have some control over the way I use my time and so forth. But some people are in jobs that just push them harder and harder. And I think it's a serious problem, and financially now there really are winners and losers, and there are fewer and fewer people who feel like they can sort of make it in the world, right? So how do we challenge that, while also kind of still surviving and figuring out what we need to do for ourselves and our families. Yeah. Yes.
Mary, you've gotten involved a lot in prison ministry and in helping students get ready for prison ministries. I'm really interested in your experience of that related to this theme. Kind of what your YDS students on campus kind of are experiencing about residence and self-care or justice and self-care as they encounter people who are incarcerated.
Right. Well, I've had the privilege of being able to do some what we call inside-out teaching, where we bring some students from the outside to the inside into a same classroom with residents of a prison, right? Incarcerated persons. I don't want to call them inmates. And they work together in the same classes. And I think it's very interesting. In the last class I taught, everyone had to read a book and write a paper every week. And I can tell you the only students whose papers were late were outside students, right? And some of the inside students, first of all, had English as a second language. And secondly, had to write their papers by hand, okay? So they had a much harder task. But I think there was just great learning in people figuring out that they had more in common than they had that separated them. I'm hoping to do this again next semester, but I'm waiting to hear back from this particular prison. There is a group of students on campus, though, who are very motivated to work for prison abolition, actually, because of the real difficulties and injustices that are kind of built into the system. We're doing some little projects, not little, but pen pal projects. Again, anything to break down the walls between the inside and the outside. And sometimes, you make these efforts and you think they're only a drop in the bucket, and we're not actually, bringing down the system the way we might like to. However, if you're on the inside, it matters if someone writes to you. There's a waiting list of over 1,000 people for this program. Insiders who want to have a pen pal. I think while people are incarcerated, we don't want to forget them. That's what the system wants us to do. That's why prisons are so far away from us, where they're located. This is half the problem, is getting the students there, and getting them in. So it's very tough, but I think there's also the sort of intrinsic reward of forming relationships and recognizing each other's humanity that is a benefit to both sides.
Hi, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about maybe generational differences in the conversation about self-care. I think there are potentially, younger generations may have better language about talking about self-care, but they are also more susceptible to hustle culture and things like that. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts about generational differences when it comes to talking about self-care.
I don't know. My students are getting younger and younger. They're younger than my children. You know, when I first started teaching, all my students were older because it was a time of second career, and I was much younger. But anyway, it seems to me that, you know, our students are very actually thoughtful about that. Now, this may be a select group because they're in seminary, and they know that they have to think about these things, and they know that the work can be all-consuming. But I think there's also the thing about when you're young, you're so full of energy, and it's very possible that you can do quite a lot and pull some all-nighters and get away with it. But at crunch times in the semester, you know, it becomes clear that people are really pushed to the edge sometimes. We use a lot of mental health services in the seminaries. We have, at our school now, an embedded counselor. So I do think that the younger people are more open about talking about their needs and their crises all the time, whereas in the past it seemed like it was something that had to be hidden if you were struggling. And it's way better to be able to talk about it openly, I think. I'm not sure if that gets at your question. Yeah? Okay.
We have a question from someone online.
Mm-hmm.
Where do I go from here? I'm unsure how to find a way to let justice and self-care unfold. Prayer, of course, but my mind is so chaotic, I am less and less able to connect.
Well, one place to go might be church. It's interesting, as you know, times are changing. Sometimes the narrative gets out there that the churches are shrinking, and so you better become a chaplain if you're in pastoral care because you'll never find a full-time job. And I don't think that's true. The churches are shrinking, but there's still a great need for them. And I do think if it's not church, some other group, some other way to get together with other people in solidarity is just so important. Because we can't do this work alone. And so, you know, maybe it's going to volunteer somewhere and meeting people that way. Maybe it's trying out a congregation or two. I wasn't kidding when I said, you know, it took me a long time to find a congregation that really felt like a community, and where the sermons and the music and just the people, you know, I felt simpatico with, and that, you know, yeah. So it's a very powerful thing when you find it, but it's hard to find, I think, even for me, and having been a pastor and, you know, being in this religious community, still it was hard. So I think finding connection is important to begin to make that happen. And it may be by volunteering for a political cause that you find your circle. But yeah, we need to find what we call the club of life, the people whose values align with yours, and try to spend more time with them. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much. I have so many, probably too many thoughts. So I'm going to try to not do that thing where people just keep talking forever. So I do a lot with the arts. And one of the things that I thought as I was listening to you was about failure in the place of making. So when artists make, frequently we fail. We don't know how to do this new medium. And to admit that I'm not good at something, that I can't do this at this point is actually helpful, rather than thinking I should be perfect at it already. So I thought about that in the place of communal care, not self-care. So something I've been talking with my students about is how do we create communities that allow space for people to enact self-care, right? Rather than saying the onus is on the individual to somehow succeed in being well. And I thought about the necessity of well communities, right? Well systems to be able to know when something is wrong and to admit that, right? Because it's not about therefore we wrong or something has failed equals we are bad, but that we're not where we want to be yet, right? I wondered both about the communal aspect of care rather than self-care, and about like I fail at self-care, right? I mean the ability to fail at something and to admit, yeah, we failed and that's fine. I failed and that's fine. Does that make sense? Because sometimes this can feel so much like you didn't take care of yourself. That's why you're in this position. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
And that's not, I think, that's not
Yes.
healthy either. So
That is not helpful
I was trying to
either.
be really concise, but sorry. Thanks.
No, thank you. And I think that is a real danger when we start to talk about these things, that it becomes like this new list of obligations. And what, I'm going to fail at that too, you know? There are times when, say, you're in a really dysfunctional organization and, they're like, oh, do self-care, No, something has to change, right, in order for it to be a well system, right? So, it can be used to put more onus on individuals, which is really a problem. So again, I say it's really important to find the communities, right? It's like I try to make in my classes a space. I always try to get to sit around a table so people are looking at each other and have activities so people talk together and find each other. And I think you're really onto something when you say, we need to build the communities who can support this. Just like in the church that Anne Lamott was describing, there's all these people who are angry at each other, they're tired, that's a very normal way to be, really, in a way. And admitting that, acknowledging that, and then saying, let's try something different, who has an idea or. And I teach a course now on death and dying, and one of the assignments was you had a choice. You didn't have to do this, but one choice was to have a death dinner party, where a dinner party where you could talk about death and death over dinner. Yeah, I got that idea from a friend, and. One of the students described in her paper, and I hope it's okay for me to say this, how the group met and they talked about some difficult things, and then they began to talk about mass deaths happening far away that we feel we can do nothing about. And the mood became very, very somber. And a number of those students in this group that were meeting for dinner were Episcopalian. And they just waited for a long time. And someone said, why don't we pray the compline, right? So they went into the other room and they prayed this thing together, right? And it kind of brought them together more and, just brought them to a different space. So it is hard to contemplate these things alone. And it's easier to just turn away. But I think if we can create communities, and even in small ways, we can think more clearly about these issues. mean, art is interesting because it's, expressive, poetry, art, music. And that is another way that I think people can come together and begin to process, the difficulty of this work and find support and camaraderie.
Follow up on what Marcus said about art. My daughter was a student some years ago at the visual arts program at a magnet school locally. And what I loved about hearing her reports was how they had fostered a community where the students pointed out each other's mistakes to them, but in a spirit where that was what was expected. There was a kind of assumption that art is making mistakes, and you never do it perfectly. You always have to fix mistakes. And so they would help each other see what the mistakes were and then talk about how to fix them. And I brought that up once here as a sort of analogy. Could we teach like that? And I actually got quite a lot of pushback from this idea that we could actually tell people openly where we thought they had gone wrong. I don't know where I'm going with this, but I just think it's really interesting to reflect on how you can create a community where people can share openly their perceptions of how someone could do something better, and it's received well.
Yeah, peer review, and yeah, I think that's so important. And, even as a scholar, I always look for readers, because I'd rather hear about the mistakes before it's published than afterwards myself. But, creating communities is tough because everyone's pressed and in a hurry. But we do have in the practical theology department this tradition of having a salon twice a year, and more advanced students and professors come to it, where someone has something they're working on and they share it, and then they get feedback and information. But I think we have to kind of start with the assumption that, the first time you try something, you're not going to be great at it, right? And we need critique if it's, offered in a gentle spirit, and we need support as well.
I have this. Is it on?
It's for the folks online to be able to hear you.
Oh, hello. And so, thank you. On so many levels, the authenticity piece reminded me of a time when Merton was exactly what I needed to read. The productivity piece, there's a volume that has spoken to me that's being a disciple in a .com world, and it addresses consumerism versus faith or discipleship, and only skims the treatment of self with it. So I understand that I am one who loves art, but has eye issues, so I don't cut or write straight. You're not imagining that. And I don't read music. I do sing very loudly, and people feel like maybe the church has a place for them, even when that's who you are. So that's not all bad. But with the artist I do know and love, I see after that project, getting really nervous or anxious about what's next, or how it would be received, and so I think your community comes in there where there's a healthier space, and this conversation to link justice and yet address burnout and disillusionment is kind of a piece I hear in it. With self-care, I love it. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
See if I can get on the camera. 2 comments. Once I get this. One, the question I asked previously, she thanked us for reading her comment. I'm grateful for and wrote down your answers. I resonated with several. Tears in my eyes as I realize this is time to explore other churches after 40 years. I'll let that one sink in for a second.
Thank you.
And then another comment. This was wonderful, so helpful. I wish I would have known this earlier in my ministry. Thank you so much and blessings to all.
Thank you so much. I think we're about it.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for your talk. I just wanted to lift up a dialogue we've had in a small group when we were talking, that really I see the heart of your talk and many of the scholars that you named in your presentation as an invitation to reframe the paradigm for what it means to show up and how we show up in care. So often we form leaders for church and society that they are called to give, serve, but to really change the paradigm whereby we encourage individuals to care for themselves and encourage communities to care for the whole of the church, the organization. It really is a paradigm shift, and I think it requires risk, it requires being brave, it requires being courageous, but it also requires being able to form leaders in such a way that they feel empowered to exercise the boundaries around what care means for their own individual selves in the communities of faith and organizations that we're called to serve. I don't have an answer quite how to do that because I think I'm beginning to do that work for myself, but I also think the answer comes as we continue to evolve in our own individual faith journeys and we have a greater sense of how we connect communally with the God who has called us. In one capacity, sacrifice is very much present in how we answer the call to serve, but it does not mean that we have to lose ourselves in the context of serving. So as much as we can hear a talk on it, I think that there's an invitation in your talk and the scholars that you've referenced and how we engage forming ourselves as we answer vocation and the leaders that we're called to equip and help form for church and society. So thank you for your talk.
Thank you so much. And I think that it is so important for leaders to model self-care. And again, if you feel like you can't do it, it's too selfish, think you're doing a service if you can model something. Because people do try to imitate their leaders. Yeah.
So what came to mind as you were speaking is giving yourself permission to be vulnerable and that's okay. Because that's a part of being able to get self-care yourself. You have to realize that you're vulnerable, and it's okay to say, I can't do this, or I need help doing this, or whatever it is, for all of us.
Thank you. Yeah. It is admitting, you're not super man or woman or, All right. Well, thank you so much. It's been a great audience. Thank you. Well honored. So glad to be with you.